In the last couple of parts, we looked at both the cost and efficacy of both universal healthcare and also private healthcare. We found that universal healthcare is both cheaper than private healthcare, and also there was no real difference between the quality of the two systems. Something I didn't include in the last episode was that the wait times are significantly longer under universal healthcare. I didn't include it because I didn't think it would be that relevant. It's not relevant because by all other metrics, the two systems are identical. So if you know more likely to die, then surely you can wait a couple of hours, right? This time we're going to look at whether the systems can last. I'm going to start this off by saying I don't think that the American system is working now, and I don't think it ever will work in the future. This is because, as CNBC reported, 32% of Americans have medical debt, and over half of those defaulted on those debt. This was based on a salary finance report, but I couldn't get access to it. Apparently the email I use for this channel isn't a business email. So I use my actual email address, the one that I have access to the domain of and admin privileges on the actual email. I thought maybe it wasn't letting me in because originally it was an @gmail.com address. But I guess to them, I'm a nobody. So sad times indeed. So we're going to have to go with the CNBC retelling of the report, which I don't think would be particularly incorrect. So let's take it at face value. 32% of Americans are in medical debt, and half of those defaulted on the debt. I think that's reason enough to say that the system doesn't work. We're going to look broadly as to why the American system doesn't work outside of that, but the main focus for this video is going to be on the shortcomings of the NHS and how they can be improved. In recent years, Brits have grown accustomed to seeing news stories about overworked doctors and nurses, as well as news stories about underpaid hospital workers. So let's investigate this a little further. How much do doctors and nurses actually earn at the lowest level? Well, a doctor at the lowest level, a foundation training doctor, will earn £28,243. Foundation training doctor is someone who's immediately qualified out of medical school and gone into the workplace. This is £8,000 higher than the national living wage, which, if we use London's living wage of £10.75 and a 7.5-hour 5-day-a-week work week, that works out to be around about £20,000. So why do people in the UK say that doctors need a pay rise? Well, maybe this excerpt from Adam Kay's This Is Going to Hurt, as read by Adam Kay himself, will explain why.
Among the funny and the mundane, the countless objects in orifices and the petty bureaucracies, I was reminded of the brutal hours and the colossal impact being a junior doctor had on my life. Reading back, it felt extreme and unreasonable in terms of what was expected of me, but at the time, I just accepted it as part of the job. There were points where I wouldn't have flinched if an entry read, "Swam to Iceland for antenatal clinic," or "Had to eat a helicopter today."
Or, far more damning, this one.
Monday, 6th of December 2004. All junior doctors at the hospital have been asked to sign a document opting out of the European Working Time Directive, a law that limits work to 48 hours per week, because our contracts are non-compliant with it. This week I have seen H for under 2 hours and worked for a grand total of 97. Non-compliant doesn't quite seem to cover it. My contract has taken the directive, dragged it screaming from its bed in the dead of night, and waterboarded it.
This is a book I highly recommend reading, as to the follow-up book, Twas the Night Shift Before Christmas. Both books give a gripping and humorous look into the life of an NHS doctor, and I promise I'm not just saying that because I want this to be classified as fair use. It's also common for nurses to have to do the same long hours, with the Royal College of Nurses noting that you can't work more than 48 hours a week unless you sign an opt-out form. Which, let's be honest, they're probably going to have to sign. So what are nurses paid for this excruciating, grueling hours? £25,000, or a little bit short of that. So why were there stories of nurses using food banks? Well, interestingly, Full Fact, a non-profit fact-checking charity, found that there were nurses who used food banks, but no evidence to the scale of that use. Which makes sense. I don't think it unreasonable to think that there were some nurses who did need to use a food bank, and I think that's still appalling. But in the grand scheme of things, wage isn't really the issue. The time committed to the job is. Ultimately, we need to hire more doctors and nurses so that the current staff have time to recharge and recover from such a mentally taxing job. It's no wonder that if you're a nurse and a female, you're 24% more likely to commit suicide than the national average for females. We need to hire more staff, otherwise the NHS will crash and burn. Doctors make more mistakes when they're tired, which means that there'll be a higher rate of unnecessary deaths, and we need to stop this wage dilution of health professionals. Otherwise, that relative slight advantage we had from the last video will slip from our fingers. So is it a funding issue then, you might be wondering? In 2019 to 2020, the NHS had a budget of £140.4 billion. Is that enough? Well, in 2018, Full Facts did a dive into the budget of that year, which was £129 billion. The funding was found to be tight, and the care had to be rationed because of it. Pretty damning stuff. So adjusting for inflation, the same budget would be £132 billion. So the government did increase spending over inflation, but it isn't really enough to hire more staff across the board. The UK has an ageing population and healthcare costs are only going to go up. The NHS needs a cash injection to keep it going. But as the Nuffield Trust found in 2018, the budget as a proportion of GDP has been slowly declining since 2010. They also noted that if the budget was 7.6% of GDP in 2018 and onwards, it would give a 3.3% budget increase, or around about £11.4 billion. A 1.8% increase was planned and was adopted. They said that the extra money could be used for pay rises and would be welcomed by the public, who had concerns at the time over the NHS growth, and in fact still do, for that matter. To me, I think hiring more staff is more important than a pay rise, but I am conscious of the fact that the cost of living goes up each year with inflation, and if we never give the NHS a pay rise again, they will eventually no longer be able to eat or live in a home that they choose to live in. This is a great fear and something that any country wanting to get into universal healthcare should be worried about. The cost of coverage will go up over time. The better your healthcare is, the longer people live, and thus, with each cycle, the cost grows. It's not enough to simply raise by inflation. The trust needs money for times of crisis. Very quickly stock up on drugs, PPE, and equipment that they need. But it is doable, very doable, and without a tax rise for the most part. It works on a principle that the healthier a worker is, that the more people are going to be able to pay tax, and thus the bigger the economy is. This cycle works in both ways, in a constant state of flux. As the population ages, the more stress there will be on the NHS. And if the wages are kept the same, then the more diluted those staff's wage will become. The NHS, on its current trajectory, is not sustainable, but the system itself is. It's not a case of lack of money available, since the government can clearly spare it if they're going to give a rise to the budget of the military. They are choosing not to. So make no mistake, American viewers, it is not the system that is failing. It is those who watch the system. So my message to the Brits here is, who watches The Watchmen? You do. One of the key reasons the American healthcare system fails in such a spectacular way, in my opinion of course, is because when you're dying, you don't really get to shop around for the best deal. I could see an argument of outpatient procedures working under a private model, but inpatient procedures never will. If you had an accident and need an emergency care, you can't really tell the ambulance driver which hospital to go to. They will just take you to the nearest one. This then gets made worse by a series of insurance companies making deals with hospitals to raise the price of care for all but their customers. It is possible that it's the hospital raising the prices voluntarily rather than pressure from the insurance companies, because they could be keeping them high in order to keep insurance companies in their network. It could also be because they want to get more money from the insurance companies when they go through negotiation. There is arguments for both sides. Either way, the consumer is the one that loses out, because that price is always going to be passed back on to the consumer. The consumer in this case being people who are dying in a hospital bed. It doesn't help that the charge master, the document that controls the prices, until recently, has been hidden behind closed doors. If you want them, by the way, they're citation number 18. This is really bad form for citations, by the way, when you're doing it in this particular manner. I have no statement to attach this citation to. I just think you need this information. Another issue with the US system is that there are so many insurance companies. This may seem counterintuitive, but just hear me out. Let's imagine for a second that you're a hospital administrator with two insurance companies coming to you to get a quote for some procedure. Which one are you going to give the more favourable rate to? The one with more or less members on their network? Obviously more, because you're more likely to recoup that cost somewhere else, because you have a theoretically larger consumer base. In addition, it's more difficult to negotiate with drug companies over prices if they don't know how many people are going to need them drugs. In terms of negotiation with drug companies, it's better to have one company, or one body, should I say, to make all those decisions. That way they can sell in larger books and still make a profit. There's a great End to Shikari song that has the lyrics, "Illness is not an indulgence for which you should pay for, nor is it a crime for which you should be punished." And I do agree to an extent. A hospital should not be run for profit, and ideally a pharmaceuticals company would be government run. But I do find it interesting that of all the news stories about Big Pharma being bad pharma, they mostly come from the US, and I think that's for a reason. In the UK, drugs are monitored by the government, bought by the government, and it's illegal for doctors to push a brand on you. Because of this, UK-based pharma, they just make the drugs, fulfill the contracts, and have a nice profit because of it. It's a win-win for everyone. While in America, pharma has to sell, make, distribute, market, and push those drugs. They have massive marketing budgets for these drugs, and push drugs on doctors. Always ask for the generics, even if your doctor insists that Ambien puts you to sleep better than anything else. Buy Zorpidine tartrate. If they tell you that Nurofen is the bee's knees, then get ibuprofen. If he tells you that you need Viagra, get sildenafil. I could go on for hours. The fact that doctors are taking out for nice dinners in order to encourage them to stock the brand instead of the generic is a highly questionable state of affairs. Even if doctors aren't legally allowed to push you drugs, the fact that drug companies are allowed to get away with these practices is abhorrent. The American system, like the NHS, will only get more expensive. However, unlike the NHS, the cost is going to be pushed onto the patients, whereas with the NHS, the cost gets pushed onto the government. I highly recommend that you consider the benefits of universal coverage, and I hope that today I've showed you the flaws in both systems so that you'll be able to understand what's going wrong and how to stop it from going wrong. I hope that I've showed you the flaws in both systems, but that you'll be able to understand that privatizing the system only amplifies those issues. Instead of the bill being increased for the government, it ends up being pushed on the population. That's the end of this little 3-part look into healthcare. We might revisit this one day and go back on some issues that we've missed, so I do strongly recommend you leave a comment below with any ones that we have missed, and we will try and respond to them when we can. Until next time, goodbye.